Let's begin our journey into the surprising truths about King David. What if the Bible's most famous hero, King David, who everyone calls a man after God's own heart, actually did some truly awful, sneaky, and even mean things that you would never hear about in church on Sunday? What if his story is much, much darker than the happy songs and brave fights you know? That's right, the great King David has a secret, dark side that most people never talk about. Close your eyes and allow yourself to rest as we explore the forgotten moments that might hold deeper secrets than we realize. This is today's bedtime story. Let's begin. Think about what you usually know about David. He was a brave shepherd boy who fought the giant Goliath and won, making everyone cheer. He was a good musician who played the harp for King Saul. He wrote many beautiful songs in the Bible called psalms, where he talked about loving God. He seems like the perfect hero, always doing the right thing. But what if that's not the whole story? What if the Bible tells us about times when David was not so good? Times when he acted selfishly or even cruelly? It's like having a favorite superhero doll and then finding out the superhero actually did something really bad when nobody was looking. It makes your brain feel fuzzy, right? You'd wonder, how can someone so good do something so bad? These dark parts of David's life are hidden in plain sight in the Bible. They're not in a secret code, they're written right there. But grown-ups often choose to skip over them in church. They might talk about David's good parts, but they avoid the parts where he makes huge mistakes or does things that hurt other people badly. It's like they want to keep David looking perfect, so you don't get confused or ask tricky questions. They might worry that if you see David's bad side, you might not believe he was a hero anymore. But learning about David's dark side isn't about saying he wasn't important or that God didn't use him. It's about seeing the whole truth. It shows us that even the biggest heroes in the Bible were real people with real problems and real mistakes, just like us. And sometimes their mistakes were very, very big. Understanding these parts helps us see that God can still work with people who mess up, but it also shows us that bad choices have big, sad results. As we go through this video, we're going to pull back the curtain and show you the actual Bible stories that prove this shocking claim about King David's dark side. You'll see for yourself the actions that many don't want you to know about, and it will truly change how you see this famous king. So get ready to discover the parts of King David's story that are kept quiet, the sides of him that the church often doesn't talk about. Let's talk about the first really big, dark secret about King David, one that might make your jaw drop. What if the Bible tells us that King David, the man after God's own heart, actually stole another man's wife, got her pregnant, and then made sure her husband was killed in a fight, all just to keep his secret hidden? That's right, it wasn't just a tiny mistake. It was a huge, awful plan to cover up something very bad. You usually hear about David fighting bravely, but this story shows him doing something very sneaky and mean. Think about how serious it is to take someone else's husband or wife. That's a very big rule that almost everyone agrees on, right? And then imagine getting someone killed just so your secret doesn't get out. That's even worse. This story makes us see David in a totally different way than the brave hero who defeated Goliath. It makes us wonder, how can someone God loved so much do something so terrible? And why isn't this talked about more often in church? The Bible tells us this story very clearly in the book of 2 Samuel. It says that one evening, David was walking on his roof and saw a beautiful woman, Bathsheba, taking a bath. He sent for her and spent time with her, even though she was married to a good soldier named Uriah the Hittite. Soon, Bathsheba sent a message to David saying she was going to have a baby. David knew this was a huge problem because everyone would know he had done something wrong. So, David made a plan. First, he told Uriah to come home from the war, hoping Uriah would spend time with his wife and people would think the baby was Uriah's. But Uriah was a loyal soldier and wouldn't go home to his comfy house while his friends were still fighting in a tent. So David's first plan failed. Then David came up with an even worse plan. He wrote a letter to his army general, Joab, telling him to put Uriah in the most dangerous part of the battle, right where the fighting was worst, and then have the other soldiers step back so Uriah would surely be killed. And that's exactly what happened. Uriah died in the fight, just as David planned. After Uriah was dead, David then took Bathsheba to be his own wife, hoping everyone would just think it was normal. He thought his secret was safe. This shows a very dark side of David. Not just making him had not just one or two wives, but many, many wives, and even more special servants called concubines. Living together in a huge royal house? And what if taking all these women wasn't just about love, but about showing off his power and making tricky deals to become an even stronger king? That's right. David's house was like a whole village full of women, and the Bible tells us all about it, even though it's a bit strange to hear. Think about what we usually learn about marriage in the Bible. It often talks about one man and one woman, keeping families simple and strong. So when you hear that King David had so many wives, names like Michal, Abigail, Ahinoam, Maacah, Haggith, Abital, and of course Bathsheba, plus many, many more special servants who lived with him, it feels very, very different. It's like finding out your favorite sports hero was actually playing on 10 different teams at once. It makes you wonder, if God's law usually talks about one man and one woman, why did he let David have so many? It's a complicated part of the Bible that shows us how different life was long, long ago, and how even good people in the Bible lived in ways that seem strange to us now. It reminds us that the Bible shows people as they really were, not always as we wish they were. This surprising claim about his giant royal family was a real and very public part of his life. This detail about David's life truly changes how we see his kingdom and makes us think about how power and family were all mixed up in olden times. It's a truth about King David that the church often doesn't want to talk about. Let's talk about another really upsetting secret hiding in King David's family story. What if King David, the wise and fair king, knew that one of his own sons, Amnon, hurt his own sister, Tamar, in a terrible way, but David did almost nothing to punish his son for it? That's right, did not punish Amnon. 2 Samuel 13:21. This is the shocking part. David got mad, but he didn't do anything to Amnon, even though what Amnon did was a huge crime that broke God's rules and hurt his own sister terribly. Why would King David, who was so quick to punish others, just let this terrible thing go? This is a very tough question that makes many people wonder about David. Maybe he loved Amnon too much. Maybe he thought it was too messy to deal with in his own family. Whatever the reason, his silence and his choice not to punish Amnon caused a lot of pain and led to even more trouble in his family later on. It shows that even great kings can fail their families, and that not dealing with bad things can make even bigger problems. This messy family problem is often skipped in church because it's so uncomfortable and hard to explain why David acted this way. This is the sad and shocking story of Amnon, Tamar, and King David's surprising silence. David's failure as a father and a king is written right there in the Holy Book. This painful detail about David's family life truly changes how we see him and makes us think about how even heroes can make big mistakes in their own homes, and how those mistakes can cause deep wounds that don't heal easily. Let's open another secret chapter from King David's life that will truly shock you. What if King David's own son, Absalom, not only plotted to steal his father's throne, but also did something incredibly gross and public right on the roof of the palace? He slept with his father's special wives or concubines for everyone to see. This isn't just a regular family fight. It's a huge, messy, and very wrong act of war and shame. It sounds like something from a made-up story, but it's really in the Bible. Think about how bad it would be for a son to try and take his dad's job, especially if his dad is the king. That's a huge betrayal. But Absalom, David's son, did just that. He was very handsome and charming, and he slowly tricked people into supporting him instead of his father. He wanted to be king, and he wanted to make his father, David, look weak and unimportant. This was a super sad time for David, because his own son was fighting against him. But then, Absalom did something even worse and more shocking. The Bible tells us that when Absalom marched into Jerusalem and took over the palace, he listened to bad advice from one of David's old helpers. This helper told Absalom to do something very public and very shameful. He told Absalom to go up on the roof of the palace, where everyone in the city could see him, and sleep with David's concubines, his special wives. This was not about love or family. It was a nasty way to show everyone that David was no longer king and that Absalom was taking everything that belonged to his father. It was like spitting in David's face in front of the whole country. This terrible act was meant to hurt David deeply and show everyone that Absalom was now the real king and that David was finished. It was a very old, very mean way to make sure people knew who was in charge and that there was no going back. Imagine how much that would hurt David. Not just that his son stole his job, but that he shamed him in such a terrible, public way. Why is this shocking story often skipped in church? Because it's so uncomfortable and messed up. It shows families breaking apart in the worst ways, with betrayal and truly awful acts. It doesn't fit the perfect picture of heroes we often like to think about in the Bible, but it's in the Bible to show us how bad sin can be and how even family members can do terrible things to each other when power and anger take over. This shocking story of Absalom's rebellion and his terrible public act on the palace roof proves that this dark side of King David's family life is written directly in the Holy Book. This awful detail truly changes how we see David's family and shows us just how much pain and trouble his own choices and his children's actions brought into his life. Let's uncover another very puzzling and upsetting secret about King David. What if King David, the very same king who was so close to God, did something that made God so incredibly angry that God sent a terrible sickness that killed thousands and thousands of innocent people? And what if the Bible doesn't even fully explain why David did this one thing that made God so mad? That's right, a simple choice by David led to a huge disaster, and it's a very strange and dark part of his story. Think about it like this. Imagine a very good kid who suddenly does one small thing wrong, and then a giant awful storm comes and causes a lot of trouble for everyone around them, even people who did nothing wrong. It seems super unfair, doesn't it? Well, the Bible tells us that King David decided to count all the fighting men in his country, in both Israel and Judah. It's called taking a census, like counting how many students are in a school. This sounds like a normal thing for a king to do, right? To know how big his army is. But for some reason, the Bible tells us that this act made God furious. It doesn't clearly say why it made God so angry. Some smart people think maybe David was counting his men because he trusted in his big army more than he trusted in God to protect his kingdom. Or maybe it was just a matter of David's own big pride, thinking he was so powerful. Whatever the reason, God was truly upset by David's choice. And because God was so angry, he gave David 3 terrible choices for punishment. 3 years of hunger in the land, 3 months of running away from his enemies, or 3 days of a very bad sickness called a plague spreading through his country. David chose the 3 days of plague, and the Bible says that God sent an angel and this sickness spread so fast and so far that 70,000 people died in just those 3 days. Think of that. 70,000 innocent people dying because of one choice made by their king. It's a truly horrifying and sad part of David's story. Why is this puzzling and awful story often skipped or quickly passed over in church? Because it's very hard to understand why God would punish so many innocent people for one act by their king, especially an act that seems pretty normal. It makes us ask tough questions about God's ways and about justice. It also shows that even the biggest heroes like David could make big mistakes that had terrible, terrible results for many others. This part of the Bible reminds us that God's anger can be very powerful, and sometimes His ways are very hard for us to understand. This shocking story of David's unexplained census and the terrible sickness that followed proves that this dark and confusing event from David's life is written clearly in the Holy Book. This puzzling detail truly changes how we think about King David and the big, hard consequences that even one seemingly small mistake by a leader can bring. Let's uncover another surprising and very dark secret from King David's story, one that happens right at the very end of his life. What if King David, who was known for being kind and forgiving, actually told his son Solomon, right before he died, to be mean to some people and even have them killed, even though David had made promises to them before? That's right. The great King David, on his deathbed, had a secret list of people he wanted Solomon to get rid of, even old friends. This shows a very sneaky and unforgiving side of David that you almost never hear about. Think about how people usually act when they are about to die. They often say loving goodbyes, give wise advice, and forgive everyone. We expect David, This is a very tough question that makes many people wonder about David's true feelings. It's like finding out your favorite grandparent secretly wrote down a list of people they wanted you to get revenge on. It doesn't seem to fit with the loving image of David. This part of the Bible shows that David held on to anger and old grudges, even when he was about to meet God. He didn't forget the wrongs done to him or by his own men. This dark instruction from David is often skipped in church because it's hard to make sense of. It doesn't show David in a forgiving or peaceful light. It shows a king who was still thinking about power and making sure all his enemies were dealt with, even after he was gone. It reveals a tough, calculating side of David that most people prefer not to imagine. This surprising story of David's deathbed wishes for vengeance, proving that this dark side of King David's character is written clearly in the Holy Book. This surprising detail truly changes how we see the man after God's own heart, and reminds us that even heroes had human flaws and complex feelings right up to their very last breath. Let's look at another very harsh and shocking secret about King David, one that comes from his time as a powerful warrior. King David, the great leader who fought for God's people, also did some incredibly cruel and scary things to the people he beat in war, like making them work with sharp saws or putting them into fiery brick ovens. That's right, the Bible shows a side of David in battle that is much, much tougher and more frightening than just fighting fair. Think about how we usually picture war heroes. They fight bravely, win battles, and then maybe shake hands or help the people they defeated. But the Bible tells us a very different story about King David after some of his biggest wins. In the book of 2 Samuel, it talks about David conquering a group of people called the Ammonites and their city, Rabbah. And after he won, the Bible says he made them suffer in ways that are hard to hear about. The verses say that David brought out the people who were in it and put them to work with saws and iron picks and iron axes, and made them toil at brickmaking. 2 Samuel 12:31, ESV. Some old translations or ways of reading this make it sound even worse, as if he made them go through saws or under iron tools, or even put them in fiery brick kilns, like giant ovens for making bricks. This is a very, very harsh punishment. It's like finding out your favorite sports team, after winning the big game, did something incredibly mean and painful to the other team, much worse than just shaking hands. It makes you wonder, did God really want them to be treated like that? Is that how a hero should act? This part of David's story is often skipped in church because it's so uncomfortable and hard to understand. It doesn't fit with the idea of a kind leader or a merciful hero. It shows a David who was very, very tough and even brutal in war, using extreme punishments to show who was boss and to make sure his enemies never fought him again. It reminds us that wars in olden times were incredibly cruel, and even Bible heroes sometimes did things that seem shocking to us today. It pushes us to think about how we understand justice in ancient times versus now. This is the harsh story of King David's cruelty in war. This dark and difficult side of his conquests is written clearly in the Holy Book. This surprising detail truly changes how we see King David as a warrior and makes us think about the truly hard things that happened in ancient battles. Let's uncover another surprising and tricky secret about King David, right from the beginning of his rise to power. What if King David, the future hero king, used promises of marriage to King Saul's daughters not just because he loved them, but as a clever, even sneaky way to climb his way up to the throne? What if his early marriages were more about gaining power than finding true love? That's right. The Bible shows that David was very smart about how he got his power, and it wasn't always about simple romance. Think about how we usually hear about princes and princesses getting married. It's often a sweet story of falling in love. But in olden times, marriages between royal families were super important for power. If you married the king's daughter, it meant you were close to the king, and maybe you could even become king someday. The Bible tells us about King Saul, who was the first king, and how he was upset with David. Saul tried to trick David. First, he promised David his oldest daughter, Merab, if David would fight bravely in a war. David fought bravely, but then Saul gave Merab to another man instead. This shows that promises could be broken, even by a king. Then, Saul had another daughter, Michal, who truly loved David. Saul saw this and thought of a new trick. He offered Michal to David, but he asked for a very strange and dangerous dowry, a gift the groom gives to the bride's family. Saul told David he wanted 100 bad guys, Philistines, to be defeated and proof of it. Saul hoped David would get killed trying to do this, but David was super brave and smart. He fought and won, bringing back twice as much proof as Saul asked for. So, David married Michal. This marriage connected him directly to the royal family. This part of David's story is often skipped in church because it's messy and complicated. It shows King Saul trying to trick and hurt David, and David using his bravery not just to win battles, but also to gain a powerful place in the king's family. It makes us wonder, was David just being smart, or was he also a little bit sneaky in his climb to power? These marriages weren't always about happy love stories. They were big political moves. It shows that even in Bible times, getting to be king was a tough game with lots of plans and tricky deals. This is the surprising story of King Saul's daughters and David's clever, powerful marriages. This dark and strategic side of David's early life is written directly in the Holy Book. This surprising detail truly changes how we see King David's path to the throne, and reminds us that becoming a king in olden times was often about more than just being brave and good. Let's wrap up our journey into King David's hidden story by looking at the biggest secret of all. What if the reason you almost never hear about King David's super dark, messy, and sometimes cruel actions in church isn't because they're not in the Bible, but because pastors and teachers choose to keep quiet about them? Maybe to make David seem perfect, or to make faith feel easier and less confusing. That's right, the silence itself is a big part of the story. Think about it. We've talked about David stealing a wife and getting her husband killed. having a palace full of many wives, letting his own son get away with hurting his sister, sending a terrible sickness on his people, telling his son to kill his enemies on his deathbed, and being very, very harsh in war. These are huge, challenging stories. But when was the last time you heard a whole sermon about David's cruel acts in battle? Or how he didn't punish his son Amnon? Probably never, right? Why is that? Well, church leaders often have a very important job to teach about God's love, about forgiveness, and about how to live a good life. They want to inspire people and make faith feel hopeful and strong. So when they tell stories from the Bible, they often pick the parts that show heroes doing good things, or learning big lessons, or being forgiven. It's much easier to talk about David fighting Goliath or writing beautiful songs than it used to explain why he murdered Uriah or had so many wives. It's not always about trying to hide things in a sneaky way. Sometimes it's because these dark stories are just very hard to explain, especially to kids. They raise really big, tough questions about why God would still use someone who did such bad things, or how God's rules worked back then compared to now. It's much simpler to focus on the easy, happy, or inspiring parts of the Bible. They might worry that if they talk about David's bad side too much, people might get confused, or lose their faith, or think that if David could do bad things, then maybe God isn't as good as they thought. But by skipping these parts, we get an unfinished picture of King David. We miss out on seeing that even the Bible's biggest heroes were real, flawed people, just like us. And it reminds us that God works with imperfect people, and that even when people make huge mistakes, God's plan can still move forward. It also teaches us that even very old holy books are honest about the struggles and sins of the people in them. These difficult stories about King David's dark side are so often left out of church discussions. The silence is a true part of how the Bible is taught today. This understanding truly changes how you might listen to sermons and how you think about the whole, amazing, and sometimes very complicated story of King David. Well, that's all for today's Secret Bible Story. Next time, get ready for even more amazing stuff when we talk about the forbidden chapters of the Bible they don't want you to read. Don't miss it.